Hello, welcome to Image Bearers. My name is Otoma Edje. This is season 3, episode 60. I'm very excited to have on the program today Ellen Radcliff. I wanted to have her on today to really just talk about same-sex attracted individuals in our community, in our families. And I feel it's something that we definitely need to have the right heart, which is Jesus' heart about it, and also his conviction where we need to have his conviction. And so I'm glad we're having this conversation. So a little bit about Ellen. She is a faithful Christian wife, daughter, and mother who navigates the nuanced realities of living as a same-sex attracted follower of Christ. She has a BA in interpersonal communication from East Carolina University and an MA in counseling from Hardin School of Theology. She is a licensed clinical mental health counselor associate and a licensed marriage and family therapist associate. And according to Guy Hammond, she is a ministry go-to person for all things transgender. She also oversees a women's ministry in strength and weakness, offering assistance to same-gender attracted Christian women worldwide. Ellen is also the owner of Oasis Counseling and Family Therapy. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Sure. So I wanted to just go ahead and start out with the first question. So just to get our viewers to understand a little bit about you and just your history, can you kind of share your kind of like life story, if you will, but also how you got involved with the strength and weakness ministry?
Yeah, so, I grew up in God's kingdom with God at the center of my household with unconditionally loving parents. But even with all these blessings, my heart was still fraught with insecurity growing up, mostly about my femininity. I grew up in a home where my dad was sort of the epitome of the traditional stereotype for what a man is in our culture, right? He's rough and tough and gruff. And my mom is the opposite, sort of the traditional epitome of the stereotype of what a woman is in our society, gentle and quiet and nurturing. And I was and am a lot more like my dad in personality and in character, which is something I'm very proud of now. But as a young girl with a tender heart, lots of insecurities and assumptions about myself based on those insecurities, that led me to the conclusion that I was broken as a woman and that something was wrong with me because I didn't match up to this bar of femininity that I set for myself. And that bar was my mom's example of femininity, which I couldn't naturally emulate. I didn't realize at the time that there are multiple ways to be feminine or masculine, right? So I walked around with this incredible shame that I unknowingly masked as anger and hardness and superiority, especially directed toward my mom. Because deep down, I resented her example of femininity and the inadequacy that it bred in my heart for me. So when I got into high school, after harboring this insecurity and shame my whole life, looking for validation that I was woman enough, I very innocently befriended a girl that I just simply admired. She was a bit more like me, she was opinionated, strong-willed, outspoken, but she seemed okay with those parts of her. Whereas I had grown up so ashamed of those parts of me. And so as our friendship developed, so did my infatuation of her. And she eventually became my idol. Got to the point where my entire identity and sense of self-worth was completely wrapped up in her and in our friendship. And so this relationship became emotionally enmeshed very quickly. And for me, it bordered on obsessive. And honestly, when this level of emotional attachment has reached this level of idolatry in a friendship, especially among women, it's so easy for a physical relationship to follow. And so that's exactly what happened. And this experience sort of springboarded me into a life of homosexuality. And I lived as a lesbian for a time before I eventually very happily surrendered my heart to God when I became a Christian. And then shortly after becoming a Christian, I joined the Strength and Weakness Ministries for help in my own walk with God. And since then, I've gotten married, I've gotten a degree in counseling. I'm now a provisionally licensed marriage and family therapist in North Carolina. And now I get to do this for a living and on a volunteer basis with Strength and Weakness. I get to walk alongside individuals and families who are wrestling through their gender and or their sexual identity. So really grateful what God has done in my life with that.
That's awesome. So you actually went obviously to Harding to get your master's. And so it's kind of like your involvement with strength and weakness. You're like, I probably need a little bit more skills as far as helping, women, and that's kind of propelled that, or how did that?
Yeah, for sure. That was a big part of it. I can't practice therapy through strength and weakness. I can certainly use my knowledge that I've, received in my degree, but I cannot practice therapy across state lines or, through strength and weakness because it's not a therapeutic platform. But that certainly was a big part of why I wanted to pursue, a degree in counseling, was because I knew this was the area of service that I wanted to pursue in God's kingdom to help people specifically in this field. And so I knew that, I think too, a part of it, if I'm being totally honest, is I wanted to figure out my own dysfunction. Like, what happened to me?
Right.
How did this happen to me? And so that was a big part too of wanting to pursue counseling specifically, just to learn more about development and sexuality in general. And then, I always intended to use it for the benefit of strength and weakness.
Well, like I said, I know, like I mentioned, I had an interview with Guy Hammond, which I'll provide a link on this channel. And the work that both of you and really everyone else involved with the Strength and Weakness Ministry is very valuable. So thank you for your service.
Thank you.
So as I mentioned in the book, Gay and Christian, question mark, I believe you wrote this one section. Mark Yarhouse once said, if you've met one person who is transgender, you've only met one person. By that he meant that everyone is unique and we should not generalize. And for us to really minister to our loved ones, I think it's important for us to understand, some of the nuance, some of the distinction there. So can you perhaps break down some of the terms that we've all heard, transgender, non-binary, gender dysphoria, intersex, and so forth?
Yeah, well, Mark Yarhouse, definitely a big scholar in the field of sexuality and gender identity. He's a, professing Christian. He's a psychologist that teaches in this area. So I love this saying that he has. If you've met one person who's transgender, you've only met one person. I always use the example of, it's like trying to figure out what language someone speaks and they tell you what continent they're from. Like, that might help us narrow it down a little bit, but that doesn't really help us to effectively communicate with someone and know them. And so similarly, someone who uses one of these big umbrella terms to describe themselves, transgender, non-binary, etc., it gives us only a tiny bit of information about them and their gender identity, but not much. We really have a lot more work to do outside of those big, broad terms to determine that person's unique experience with their gender identity. So I think too, what I'll say about, just understanding the language as Christians, my view on this, I think I've heard a lot of pushback on this, like, oh, that's the language that's created on this earth, right? We don't believe in that, so we don't need to learn the language. And of course, I totally understand that view. And I think, that's true. We are not of this world, but we do live in it. And so I wonder if part of what Paul was saying, when he calls us to be all things to all people, is that it behooves us to learn some of the language that the people of this earth use, not so that we can express agreement with them, but so that we can better communicate with them and show them the love of God, which is our ultimate goal with other people on this earth. So in that light, some of these big, umbrella terms, transgender, big umbrella term that encompasses a lot of different gender identity experiences. But I would say its most basic definition could be someone who identifies as a different gender than the gender that they were assigned at birth. Non-binary, another big umbrella term used to describe someone that does not adhere to a strict gender binary, male and female. So someone who uses this term may see gender as existing on a spectrum, and they may use any number of other terms to describe themselves as well. And then gender dysphoria is a term used by the mental health community. It's a clinical mental health diagnosis that indicates that someone has marked incongruence over their biological sex and their internal experience of their gender identity. So in order for this to be diagnosed, this incongruence also has to be accompanied by what's called marked distress over this incongruence. So distress that affects typical functioning in everyday life and really hinders your day-to-day life. I would say I would add something under that, something called rapid onset gender dysphoria or adolescent onset gender dysphoria. This is currently a non-clinical subcategory of gender dysphoria. So this is still a new phenomenon that social scientists are still learning about. But as of now, this is viewed as a much quicker process. These are not people that would say that, from their earliest memory, they felt that they're in the wrong body. They might say that this feeling of incongruence with their gender happened quickly, usually within adolescence between the ages of about 12 to 18. So what I've seen just in my personal practice is that people whose experience falls more in line with this rapid onset gender dysphoria, they may use the term transgender or another term within that umbrella to describe who they are rather than how they are or how they experience their gender identity. So whatever term they use is very tied to their identity, which is a really big deal during that age range, trying to piece together who you are. And so, this is why it can feel so much more volatile with this particular experience, because when this person feels rejection from someone else over their gender binary or over their gender identity, they're not just feeling a rejection over a part of themselves or how they experience their gender identity. They're feeling a rejection of what feels like the very core of their identity. So we've got to be really careful with that. And then I guess the final one I would say is the term intersex. This is brought up a lot within this conversation. The LGBTQ community is now the LGBTQIA plus, right? And the I stands for intersex. There are a lot of intersex individuals that don't like being lumped in with the T crowd, with the transgender crowd, because intersex individuals, this is not a choice for them, right? This is a physical abnormality that they're dealing with. So the term intersex is used for individuals who are born with physical abnormalities in either their genitals or their secondary sex characteristics, like their chromosomes or their hormones. So the highest statistic out there right now says that 1.7% of the population has an intersex condition. And of that 1.7%, 99% of those cases are not ambiguous. It's either a male with an abnormality or a female with an abnormality. Only 1% of that 1.7% would experience some level of ambiguity in their genitals such that there could not be a determination made as to whether that person was a male or female at birth. So this is extremely rare. However, it does happen in our world and certainly deserves just the utmost compassion for those in our lives who are dealing with this. I believe, because this is a question I get a lot about this, why does this happen? In fact, just a few days ago, I had someone ask me, so which is it? Did God make a mistake, or was it the sins of the parents that caused intersex conditions? And so I would say neither. This is a product of the fall, just like any other kind of abnormality someone could be born with, right? So I certainly don't think that God made a mistake. And I also don't think it was his intention for people to be born with these abnormalities. But as a result of sin and brokenness entering into the world, creation took a turn that it was never meant to take. And this is just one of the many consequences of that. So I would say those are the big hitting, terms within this discussion.
I think it's also an opportunity for God to be glorified, which I'm sure, maybe the last thing a person may want to hear at that time. But I do think that's also, something we see in scriptures, that God can be glorified, obviously, through a lot of the challenges that we go through. So I know one of the things that was noted in the book, Gay and Christian, ? This is, I think, in probably chapters 9 or 10. I know you kind of helped put together those chapters. One of the things that is noted is in reference to people being non-binary, or, in a sense, using that term to describe themselves. And you basically have kind of worked to counsel these individuals that, as you kind of noted, we're either kind of one or the other as far as the predominant, gender. And obviously it's a very sensitive discussion and it requires a lot of wisdom. And I'm definitely glad, obviously, you're a disciple and you've obviously gone to training, to school to get trained in this. But how will you address that specifically? And what scriptures would you use to try to I mean, there isn't a specific scripture that says, binary or non-binary, obviously, but, what are some scriptures you would use that would help people with that decision in their lives?
Yeah, well, I think when it comes to counseling people who are non-binary, who identify that way, it really depends on what their worldview is, how I would go about it, right? I've had Christian clients who struggle with gender dysphoria, and we take one approach. I've had non-Christian clients who struggle with gender dysphoria, and we've taken a different approach. So, if they're not a Christian and not interested in what God has to say on the matter, then I counsel them according to that worldview and their belief system. This is a part of my code of ethics. All therapists have to uphold and respect the individual autonomy of each person. I think this is really godly too. I think it's very biblical. God gives us each free will and allows us to do with it what we want. That doesn't mean that our choices are without consequences, but he doesn't force us into anything. And this is the same way that I want to approach people who choose not to live for God. So the truth is that I'm not called to judge those outside of the church. 1 Corinthians 5 says that I am called to judge, but only those inside God's kingdom. The job of judgment of those outside of God's church lies with God alone. So
just to be a little bit, just so I'm understanding. So for example, if someone comes to you who is, not a disciple, and they are, obviously conversing with you about being non-binary, you would, in that sense, affirm that? Is that kind of what I'm understanding? Depending on, I know there's a lot of factors that may come into play, but is that kind of what you're saying, or?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say, oh, well, that's totally wrong and you're going to burn up in the fires of hell, and anything that they would expect a Christian therapist to say, maybe, right? So for example, this happened recently. I had a client, he does not have a Christian worldview, he doesn't have a belief in God, and he was really struggling with his gender identity. And so what we did is we talked about development, we talked about everything that could possibly be underlying this, some trauma that could be underlying it, some distorted beliefs from childhood that could be underlying it. And I told him right from the beginning, look, I'm not going to be, because I do think there are a lot of therapists out there who, in their fear of litigious action, will very quickly affirm and, within the first session, honestly say, here's a referral to hormone therapy treatment, right? And so I told him right from the beginning, I am not that kind of therapist, but the good news for you is that you're going to get proper treatment in this, right? That if a client walks into my office and says, I'm going to divorce my spouse, or I'm going to drop out of school, no matter what my personal worldview is, I'm going to say, okay, let's talk about that. Let's unpack that a little bit. Let's talk about where this might be coming from. Let's talk about the good and possible bad that could come about from this decision. So I'm going to do the same with someone, contemplating gender transitioning to a different gender, whether they're a Christian or not. So I'm definitely not going to very quickly say, yeah, here's a pamphlet and here's what you should do, right? I'm going to still walk them through the process of making informed, wise decisions for their life. But ultimately, the decision of whether to transition to a different gender or not is going to lie with that client, right? And most likely they're going to choose to transition if they don't hold to a Christian worldview, because it is so alluring in our society right now.
Mm-hmm. What would be some scriptures for disciples, looking at it from another angle, who are having these discussions and they're like, hey, I'm non-binary? I guess what would be the discussion that you would have, generally speaking, but also what would be some scriptures that you might share?
Yeah, well, if the person is a Christian and they're dealing with, gender dysphoria and want to remain in their natal sex, or they're dealing with unwanted same-sex attraction, then of course I would counsel them according to that worldview. And usually we would approach this like an issue with perception, right? Similar to that of anorexia. If someone who's anorexic walks into my office and says, I'm fat, I'm grotesquely overweight, and it's very distressing to me, I would never say, well, you should go remedy that by going to get liposuction, right? No, I would say, okay, well, this is an issue with your perception. The fact is that you're not fat. In fact, you're severely underweight. And we would deal with some of the underlying distorted beliefs and pain and trauma that led to this person to this distorted perspective of themselves. And so similarly, with someone approaching, gender dysphoria from a Christian perspective, we would certainly look to what God says about this. And would deal with some of the possible wounds and distortions that happened probably early in childhood or in adolescence that may have contributed toward this distorted perspective. And so, yeah, there are scriptures that specifically speak to a gender binary. In fact, right from the very beginning, God lays out the expectation for a gender binary. In Genesis 1:27, the author is, describing the creation of humans. It says, God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. Clearly, there is a binary, very obviously stated, male and female. Now, some people refute this and say, well, yeah, but the creation account is not an exhaustive list of what God created. They might use the example of rivers and marshes or frogs or dawn, right? These things are not listed in the creation account, but they do exist today. And so, yes, of course, that's true. The creation account is a foundational picture of what God created, not an exhaustive one. However, I would say to that, we do see rivers and marshes and frogs in other parts of the Bible. We do not see a reference to a gender outside of male and female. In fact, whenever mankind is referred to in the rest of the Bible, it's in binary categories, right? Husbands and wives, brothers and sisters, sons and daughters. And when crossing gender boundaries are mentioned in the Bible, it's mentioned only in the negative. We see that from scriptures like 1 Corinthians 6:9, Deuteronomy 22:5. Of course, there are lots of other scriptures related to this topic. For example, Genesis 2, Matthew 19, both reference sex difference as foundational to marriage. And then there are lots of scriptures that reference how intentionally made and sacred our bodies are. But I think Genesis 1 is definitely the most explicit scripture that directly addresses the gender binary.
Thank you. So one of the things you also alluded to a little bit earlier was transitioning. So I think people likely understood what you meant by the context of what you stated. But what guidance do you typically provide to disciples who are, kind of going through this just gender dysphoria and want to transition? I'm sure the answer is, that's not the best thing to do, but how do you approach that?
Yeah, so you're asking someone who is a disciple and is experiencing gender dysphoria.
Yes.
Yeah, so similar to, the way that I would counsel someone through it, right, is to say, look, this is an issue with perception. And sort of like what you said earlier, right, that this is not, this doesn't have to be a devastating part of your existence. This can be a really exciting opportunity to glorify God with this, right? I think too, through Strength and Weakness, we have some support groups that we offer, just help and guidance to people and just support, right? Having other people to go through life with in this area. That really helps to instill some hope in individuals dealing with gender dysphoria or unwanted same-sex attraction, because they see that this doesn't have to hinder our lives or our relationship with God, right? We can still have a healthy, joyful existence, even while we're dealing with some of these, earthly realities, right? So I think too, I would always encourage people to get their needs met by God first. Sometimes when we look to having our needs met through this earth, that's when we can really go down this spiral of distortion, right? And that's when things like transitioning to a different gender becomes really appealing and alluring. So, like just continually having our eyes on Jesus and on God and getting it really in touch with our motivation. Why are we doing this? I've talked to a lot of people who they're going through the motions of being a Christian, but they've lost sight of their motivation of why they're doing it. A lot of times the reason that they're doing it is in order to not be rebuked, or, in order to appear as if they are living a Christian life to the people that they see at church. And so that's only going to get us so far in our, resistance against temptation. We really continually every day have to be in touch with our why. Why do we do this? And I think, it starts as fear. Fear is the beginning of wisdom, right? But then it needs to move into love. It needs to come from a deep love for God.
Yeah, I think another thing that was mentioned in the book was the goal is not to be heterosexual, the goal is to be holy. And I think
Exactly.
That's perfect. And that takes it totally off of us trying to be something we cannot necessarily be, but we can be holy. And so I think that's awesome. So I think an obvious answer too about how to, our goal needs to be to love those who are transgender, and really to love everybody. We're all made in God's image. That's kind of like what the podcast is all about. But can you give us some guidance into how we can go about that? Because obviously this is, something that, we can all use some guidance on.
Yeah, well, fortunately, I think Jesus gives us a great concrete example of this, how to go about loving people. Luke 15 talks about the untouchables of that day, right? The sinners, the tax collectors. And in Luke 15, we see that those people were seeking Jesus out. He didn't chase them down. They gathered around him very willingly. And so I can't imagine that they would do that unless they felt such incredible love and warmth and unconditional acceptance first. And so I think we have to keep this example at the forefront of our minds and not get so pharisaical and lost in the behavior. What should I do to convey love, or what should I say or not say to convey love? The truth is that out of the overflow of our hearts, our mouth speaks. So we ought to spend more time preparing our frame of heart than our frame of mind, our exact words and behaviors. I certainly think it's great to give some very careful thought to our words and behaviors, but without our heart being in the right place, it's futile. The message of love will not be conveyed through our words or actions alone. So I think leaning in to things like personal refinement, engaging in sober judgment before the Lord, continually seeking to see others through his eyes can really help with this kind of inside out level of love. That said, though, I think there are behaviors that go along with this kind of unconditional love and acceptance, seeking to understand the story by asking respectful, open-ended questions, listening in order to understand, not listening in order to respond. We're so trained in our very Western society to listen in order to respond or even to refute, especially as Christians. I've been a part of a lot of prepare to answer classes that, basically prepare you to refute the thoughts and ideas of other people. Now, I think we need to be rooted in our faith, and prepare to answer can certainly help with that. But I think the problem is when we listen only to refute or to respond, we don't convey love. We ought to listen in order to understand what someone is saying and feeling, hear the underlying pain in what they're saying, the underlying hope in what they're saying. Only then can we offer true empathy and compassion and really express our love for people. And then once we've heard them, we can reflect it back to them so that they know we've heard them, right? Summarize what they said in your own words so that the distance between you and that other person lessens emotionally. And then, I think striving to see people through God's eyes is necessary in this too. We can strive to see the people in front of us as God's beloved son or daughter, not just someone in opposition to us, but as God's child. I mean, really, that alone should fill us with trembling awe and reverence when interacting with people, even people that we might not personally agree with. And then I think too, not repeating our conviction over and over. I do think it's really important for us to be upfront and very clear about our belief on this. We never want anyone to feel tricked or duped by us or by God, but we definitely don't want to beat people over the head with our convictions on this. And sometimes I think we fall into that because of our own fear of where our society is heading.
I think you're a very, very good counselor just from listening to you.
Oh, thanks.
So I think one thing that may come up in some of our lives is getting invited to a same-sex wedding. So I know you had shared a few things in the book also. I kind of keep referring to that. I don't know if do you have a copy available, or maybe we can look at one later, the cover of the book. Do you have it, or you didn't?
I don't. I have an electronic one, but I don't have one that I could hold up and show you.
Got it. But what are your thoughts as far as Christians attending same-sex weddings? And I'm sure there's a lot of nuance with that too, but.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. That's true. There is. This is not, I don't think, a black and white, definitely right or wrong answer. There's not clear direction on this specific question in the Bible. There is very clear direction that we are not meant to engage in same-sex relationships, that we're not meant to cross a gender binary or, to cross gender boundaries. But there's not clear direction on whether we can attend a wedding of someone who's not a Christian, right? So this might boil down to a matter of conscience, and therefore we will each have to wrestle before God with what our consciences will allow. So I don't think we can say, definitely what is right or wrong here, but I do think there are some considerations that everyone can make as they're wrestling through this in their conscience. First consideration I would say is, are one or both of the people in this couple professing Christians? If so, I think it's pretty clear that we have a God-ordained responsibility to exhort them toward obedience. 1 Corinthians 5, again, is pretty clear that we are to judge the actions, not the hearts, but the actions of Christians by holding them up to the standards of God. And if they engage in unrepentant continual sin, then we're to have nothing to do with them. So I would say if this is a professing Christian, we need to, lovingly and respectfully point them back to God in this. If this person is not a Christian, then for me, the how is more important than the what here. What someone decides, I don't think is explicitly stated as right or wrong in the Bible, but how they implement that decision can become sinful. So if someone, doesn't feel comfortable with going, but lies as to the reason why, or says, I can't attend this disgusting display of immorality, neither of those implementations of this decision would be pleasing to God. The decision to go is not inherently sinful or righteous, but the way that we go about it could become sinful. So I think we not only need to wrestle with what our decision is, but how to implement it righteously. I think if you decide not to go to a same-sex wedding, there's a way to convey that you love this person. It has nothing to do with them. It has everything to do with your devotion to God, that you can't attend the wedding. And similarly, if you do decide to attend, there is a way to convey your decision that is respectful to the couple, but also doesn't denigrate your faith. So I think too, this doesn't have to be an all or nothing decision, right? I mean, I've heard of some people saying, well, I prayed about it and I can attend the reception. That's just a party, but I can't attend the ceremony because it's the actual union. And then I've heard people say the opposite, So I think we can meet this couple where we can find some common ground, but also we can be really upfront and loving about what our consciences will and will not allow. And then finally, I would just say, be consistent with your decision here. If you couldn't in good conscience attend the wedding of a couple who is actively engaging in sexual immorality through homosexuality, then I would assume you wouldn't be able to attend the wedding of a couple who is sleeping together before the wedding, which is also sexual immorality.
So a heterosexual couple, in other words.
A heterosexual couple, engaging in sexual immorality. So, we need to be consistent with our decision and be careful not to elevate the sin of homosexuality above other sins.
Good point. That's a good one. I had not heard that one, but that is definitely something to consider as far as consistency. So I think obviously you're a counselor. You may get this question perhaps from parents when they, hear from their kids that, they have come out as gay or same-sex or so forth, same-sex attracted. How do you typically approach this, and what are some of the words or guidance you would provide to parents in this situation?
Yeah, wow, that is a big question. Certainly one too big to answer fully in one setting. I'm actually currently writing a book surrounding this very topic because it's so big and pressing, not just for parents of teenagers, although I would say that's the most pressing need out there right now. That's who I hear from most, parents of teenagers who have come out as LGBTQ, but also parents of young children are having a really hard time orienting their children to this topic in our, very modern world while trying to maintain a godly perspective in it. So I would say for parents of children who have just come out, I would say don't hardly say anything during the initial conversation with your child coming out. Just listen, reflect, express unconditional love, even admiration and validation if you can. Then after that initial conversation with them, ask for time. You want to make sure you set a time frame. This is a scary topic, so it's all too easy to say, well, we'll talk about this soon. And soon turns into years because we're, burying our head in the sand. And meanwhile, shame and isolation is breeding the whole time in our children's hearts. So definitely set up a time for a follow-up conversation while also building in some processing time for you. Something like, honey, wow, thank you so much for telling us this. I can imagine how tough it was for you to express this to us. I hope you know this, but I just want to reiterate that there is absolutely nothing you could do or say that would ever make us love you less or differently. I'm so proud of you for telling us this. We love you so much. Daddy and I need some time to process this and to pray about it. We really want to have a follow-up conversation about this just to understand a little bit more about what you're experiencing and figure out what boundaries we'll have around this in our home. Can you give us a few days to process? Can we get back together Friday evening when you get home from school to talk about it then, right? So set up a time to have a follow-up conversation, express your unconditional love, and then assure them that you will process and follow up with them on this. And then I'd say during that processing time, get on your knees and beg God for wisdom and insight, for words and for unconditional love. Also, let God tend to your grief and to your broken heart. Let God put salve on your fear and your hurt. These are really real emotions that every parent I've ever spoken to feels, even shame, but rarely talks about, rarely even admits to themselves. So admit those big emotions, give them to God. Also connect with your spouse so that you don't feel alone in this. This really can drive a wedge between a husband and a wife. And then activate your support system, call on one or two close, spiritually trusted people to hold up your arms in this. Of course, you'll also want to contact Strength and Weakness and join a parent support group for just practical support and guidance through this. And then you're going to want to figure out what questions you want to ask your child about this when you do have your follow-up conversation. Things like, what's your intention in telling us this? Do you want to pursue homosexuality, or are you experiencing unwanted same-sex attraction? Where does God factor into all of this? Are you dating anyone? Is there anything else we should know? When did you first feel this way? How can we support you in this, et cetera, et cetera? You really want to draw out that story and understand where they're coming from. And then you'll also want to determine with your spouse what boundaries will surround this. At least at this point, these boundaries will need to be reevaluated, renegotiated several times. But for now, what boundaries are fair to put around this in your home? I will say too, just as a side note on boundaries, we want to make sure we're making boundaries that are in our children's best interest, not ones that only assuage our own fear. We want to respond to our kids in love, not react in our fear.
Thank you. Very, very helpful information. So another thing that I'll kind of connected to that is in reference to maybe some resources that parents could, or really anyone could, either try to read, or if there's some videos, or obviously Strength and Weakness as a resource, because I think, I don't think anyone should wait until the conversation happens, or even just the right heart and the right way of thinking all of us need to have just about these matters. And I keep going back to, the goal isn't heterosexuality, it's being holy, which is true for all of us. So are there some resources that you can recommend? Obviously, I think the book that, you, Guy, and I guess Douglas Jacoby wrote is, I think, a very great resource. And you have, as you said, another one coming out, another book coming out. But what would be some resources you can recommend?
Yeah, well, I love that you keep coming back to that. The goal is holiness, not heterosexuality. I think, parents often ask me, they want to get their kids in counseling, right? Like, oh, my kid just came out and I need to get them in counseling to fix them, right? To make this go away. And I always tell parents, like, look, your kid's best resource is you, right? So like, you need to be pursuing holiness in this. In all the different aspects, not just in your understanding of sexuality and gender, but also in, surrendering your fear and your shame to God and your control, your sense of control, right? All these other things really play into how a child will read, what they'll read from their parents emotionally, in terms of their connection. So yeah, I would say the best resource is your personal relationship with God. Nothing beats that as a personal resource. But there are some other great resources out there. Of course, Strength and Weakness, we've got, like I mentioned, support groups, probably our best thing that we can offer people. But we've also got, video series that can help you understand sexuality, the development of sexuality, how to respond to your child coming out. We've got support groups for people dealing with unwanted same-sex attraction or gender identity issues. So we've got lots of great things on there for our members. And then on my website, heartsetabove.com, I have like a whole list of resources, actually, some that pertain to same-sex attraction and some that pertain to gender identity. So I don't have them all in my head at this very moment, but it is on that website, and it's just resources, and it's a whole list of them. And so some of those resources are, things that can teach you pro-gay theology, sort of like what Guy's new book is about. Some of them are, resources for your child to join, support groups for your child to join, even if they're not a Christian. There's a big Project 619 has a whole video series for teenagers wanting to understand sexuality through God's eyes. So there's lots of great resources out there right now, because this is an ever-growing issue in our society. I would say specifically for transgender, though, I really highly suggest Preston Sprinkle's book, Embodied, and Mark Yarhouse's Understanding Gender Dysphoria. There's lots of great other ones out there, but these are definitely the most comprehensive and at the same time easily understandable that I've found so far. So for gender dysphoria, transgender topics, those are great ones. And then for same-sex attraction, I mean, the new book that Guy just wrote is great, Gay and Christian, but also his first book is called Caring Beyond the Margins, and there's an accompaniment to it called Thriving Beyond the Margins, where it's 8 Bible studies. And so that's great too, to go through with your child or with a friend who's dealing with this.
Thank you. I'm actually going to ask one additional question, and this is in reference to pro-gay theology. So I know, like, to me, obviously I've interviewed a guy, and you know this, and I'm interviewing you, but I feel like what you guys are doing is great. I think it's very biblical. I think it's right. But I do also understand there's such a thing as pro-gay theology, which is, trying to distort and blur the lines between whether a person can be a gay and a Christian, which is kind of like the premise of the book that we just mentioned. Can you maybe just share a few words about that in terms of maybe what it is, generally speaking, just a few, maybe like a cursory overview, but then also, and I think that's part of the title of the book that you and Guy wrote. I mean, this is like ramming right into the church, so to speak, as like a freight train, and something we need to be aware of and be able to, in a sense, counter it biblically. So can you share a few things maybe?
Yeah, I love that visual that Guy puts in there, that it's ramming into the train like a freight, or ramming into the church like a train without a whistle, right? That it's so silent and nefarious. And I was just writing today in a chapter that when I was a teenager, which wasn't too long ago, I had a friend in my class. She was sitting right next to me, and I said something about playing softball. And she said, "Oh, are you a lesbian?" Of course I was, but I lied to her and said, "No," like very defensively. And so not even a couple of decades ago, it was shameful to admit, even to a non-Christian friend, that you were experiencing same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria. Now, look how far we've come. It is actively praised when someone comes out as either, gay or bisexual, transgender, whatever, anything under that umbrella. And so I'm not saying we need to go back to those days that, we need to hide in shame our sexual orientation or our gender identity. I certainly don't think that's the answer. But I think we're really seeing how clearly the pendulum has swung too far to the other side. And yeah, this is really insidious, right? It affects our kids in a really sneaky way, because everywhere they look, right? TV, peers, public, everything they look at, everything they hear in our society reaffirms this message that it is praised. You are more worthy, in fact, if you are marginalized, specifically with your sexual orientation or your gender identity. And so I think we are really, especially with our kids, especially with our young kids, we're really going to have to help root them in a orientation toward God, because it's so easy to be, so culturally influenced, especially by such a hot button topic like this. I would say about pro-gay theology, it's easy for us as Christians to like point fingers and be like, how dare they distort the word of God, right? And honestly, I'll just tell you my own journey with this. That's exactly how I felt when I first, started encountering some pro-gay theology. But then the more that I listened and the more that I read, and the more that I got to know people who believed, different things than I believe, I realized that most of these people really love God, and they're really doing their best to live their life for God, just like we are. And just like we have, they might have some things wrong, just like we might, right? And so I think it's become a lot harder for me to judge the people who are, touting this pro-gay theology. I think it's very easy for me to judge the theology. That seems faulty to me, their theology. But to judge their hearts has become a lot harder, because I recognize that they love God as much as I do. They have a healthy reverence of Scripture just as much as I do. I just believe that they got a little bit of it distorted. I would also say that, once you start encountering people who really, stand by pro-gay theology, I think what you'll find is that we agree with a lot more than we disagree with. We can find a lot more common ground than things that we don't agree on. However, what we disagree on is what I would argue is a very primary issue in our relationship with God and in our salvation. So I don't, there's a sect of pro-gay theology that says, hey, can't we just all get along and, just agree to disagree and still be a part of the same fellowship? People, but to me, this is a primary issue in our faith. There are secondary issues that we can disagree on. Things like, is drinking sinful? Not in excess, but just drinking alcohol, is it sinful? Or instruments played in church sinful? Right? Things like that. We can agree to disagree on that within a fellowship. To me, this is a very primary issue. Something on the lines with baptism or the lordship of Christ, things like that. So I don't think that we can give in to pro-gay theology, that we can be sideswept by it. However, I do think we can have great compassion and connection with the people who do believe it. I don't think we need to villainize them.
Yeah, and I think Guy had a story in the beginning of his book, Gay and Christian ? Where he goes to a miracle worker, I think it is, and he kind of explains he was like searching and reaching, even though he didn't believe in the theology that was touted and the healing that could come. He still, there was still something in him that was like, maybe. And I think that's kind of like what I think is the root of that. It's like trying to mesh loving God, but then trying to reconcile, but not doing it the right way, if that makes sense. So.
Yeah, and we've all been there, right? Like we've all been so desperate to hang on to our sin that we will look, like literally, that's what our brains do. When we want to sin or when we want to engage in an addiction that we have, our brain will look down every avenue to try to figure out a way that we can make it happen, right? And so we've all been there. I think it's so easy for us to judge people who are there now, but we know what it's like to be that person. In fact, we do it every day. We sin, we look for ways to have our cake and eat it too, to glorify God, but also to have, the sin that we want.
Mm-hmm. I think I guess the closing with that is mercy triumphs over judgment. We need to know our Bibles and do what's right, but we need to have that mercy is, I think, what I'm hearing. Yeah. All right. Well, you ready for the lightning round as we wrap it up?
Oh yeah. What's the lightning round?
So I know on our show we have, sometimes some pretty heavy topics, and I think sometimes closing it out with some fun is helpful. So cool. First question is, what's your favorite food? Favorite type of food?
Oh, well, I'm Italian, so I really love, it's called arancini. They're rice balls. They're rice with meat and cheese inside, and then they're fried. Ooh.
Okay. I haven't heard of that. I need to get out more.
What's
your favorite film or series?
Ooh, favorite film or series? Oh gosh, I feel like that's a question that just changes every single day.
I know Dune.
Well, the series. Do what? What'd you say?
Dune just came out.
I know, I haven't seen it yet. The series that I could watch over and over again would be Friends. The movie that I just love so much is Rudy. This, about the football, Notre Dame football.
Yeah.
It's very inspiring.
Yeah, very inspiring. And obviously it's based on a true story, which makes it even more awesome.
Yeah, exactly.
Right now, what's your favorite book of the Bible?
Oh, my favorite book of the Bible, probably James.
Okay, straight to the point. Who's your favorite Bible character?
Abigail. She had some gumption and wisdom.
Yeah, that's for sure. And a knife. Outside of the Bible, what's your favorite book or author?
What'd you say? Apart from the Bible?
Yeah, outside of the Bible, apart from the Bible.
Oh, I really love Francine Rivers. I really like Christian fiction. So I love Francine Rivers, most of her books. And there's another author, they're a husband and wife team called Taney. Their last name is Taney. And I really love some of their series too.
Okay. I have not heard of them. What book do you think everyone should read in the next 12 months? Besides Gay and Christian, question mark.
I was going to say Gay and Christian. Well, I just read this book by Joe Dallas called Christians in a Cancel Culture. And that was really great. It touched on some of the really big hot button topics in our society today: transgender, homosexuality, race, and that might have been the big, and abortion. And so it just talked about how we can engage in conversation about these things while still upholding our faith. So I think that's a great one.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Here's a tough one. What would you say is the most important theological book in the last 50 years?
Oh, man. Gosh, I have no idea. Let me look at my books here. I mean, I think I would have to say Gay and Christian, no, and also Caring Beyond the Margins by Guy. I mean, this is such a big topic. Truly, this is a huge topic in our society and causes so much dissension and, big disagreements, and, people walk away from their faith for this topic. So I really do think that's a big, important theological book. I'm not sure it's the most important one for the past 20 years, but it's what's coming to mind right now.
No problem. What's your favorite place to live, and where would you most like to visit?
My favorite place to live, I lived in Ireland for a time, and if I could visit, if I had to visit somewhere, I'd go to Italy. I've never been. That's sort of where my ancestors are from. But yeah, I've had to live somewhere. It would be Ireland, on like the countryside of Ireland, like in a little cottage where I couldn't see people for miles.
Okay. If you could place a billboard in your city, what would it say?
I have this sign up here that says, "Jesus loves you, deal with it." So maybe I'd say that. Jesus loves you, deal with it.
That's pretty awesome. And the last one is, what's your favorite music?
My favorite kind of music or my favorite artist?
Either one.
My favorite kind of music, I don't really have a favorite kind of music. It's pretty eclectic, but also sorry at the same time. I don't listen to much music, I don't think. And I'm really not up on like current artists. My husband is, and I just discovered Adele like last year. I was like, wow, this girl's amazing. My husband's like, yeah, she's been around for a while. Actually, when I discovered her, she couldn't sing anymore. So I was like, oh man, I missed out. But I would say my favorite artist of all time is Selena, the original, Selena Quintanilla. She's no longer with us, but yeah, she's my favorite artist.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for your time. It's been very helpful, and I can tell just by your demeanor and how you communicate that you're a very good counselor. And I'm glad that you definitely added to your personality and your character just some great education. Which I'm sure goes a long way just in impacting and helping many people. So for those of you that watch this episode, please consider subscribing and clicking like so it can get all throughout the interwebs. Thanks for your time.